God evidently doesn't want me to finish this lecture because that was the doorbell that rang, and people came to visit me. Uh, uh, so getting back to, I can't even remember where I was. So this is, I guess, module 2B or not 2B. So we're continuing our discussion of the emergence of the regime and the issue of slavery. Um, Now, so we're at the Constitution. We're at the bottom of page 2, and um, and uh, uh, and I accept Willence's thesis that um, while the Articles of Confederation really was neutral on the question of slavery, because it completely left this within state jurisdiction because of the confederal nature of the Union. Therefore, slavery never really came up because the floor of citizenship was only potential and not actual. Um, and Let me plug in my microphone here. That might make a difference too. I hope the sound is better. And um, uh, Now, then the question is, uh, with respect to the erection of the Constitution as the core embodiment, the layer of governing institutions of the parchment regime, as Cropsey says, what was the disposition towards slavery? Clearly, as Willentz relates during the Constitutional Convention, um, uh, the 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 and actually, in a minute you'll see when I talk a little bit about Willentz's thesis and setting up his thesis. Um, the Southerners in the convention clearly began to feel that the emergence of a national government based on national citizenship of individual Americans, and when it became clear after the Virginia Plan and even the Great Compromise that the House of Representatives would be based upon population, that clearly awakened the self-protective instincts of the Southerners, who then began to demand protection from the Constitution for the existing institution of slavery. And they got it. Now, as you're going to see, the complexity about whether or not the founding is systemically racist, or whether or not, and the Constitution's pro-slavery, and the framers were hypocrites trying to hide their embrace of slavery because they were embarrassed by it or didn't want, um, or whether or not the Constitution is neutral or anti-slavery. That's the delicacy of this whole question. Did it embrace slavery, and or was it neutral, or was it actually hostile to slavery? And then in the terms of, because remember we're doing this level of the regime analysis, um, we come to, on the top of page 3, the custom, citizens, habit, way of life. Again, you have to remember the American people not only came into being and existence with the notion of individual Americans constituting a national people, and again, uh, at, at the risk of being repetitive, the potential tensions over slavery in the regime might have lain dormant under the Articles. But once the Constitution came into being, there was no way eventually to, and by the way, Willents does argue that the framers did make a tragic peace with slavery, and that did lead eventually to civil war, secession, and the fulfillment of the tragic promise. So it's not as if Willents is blind, or Storing is blind, um, to the effect of slavery in the constitutional order. The question of interpretation is what was the nature of the Constitution in its text and the institutional order with respect to slavery? And we'll get into that more deeply in a minute when we lay out Willentz's thesis. So, so going back to the top of page 3, the way of life and habits. So the emergence of national mobility becomes really critical. It's not so you have to see that once the Union was framed, the Constitution was adopted. Now it's true some of these issues would have emerged anyway because, as I said, I mentioned, as Willentz discusses, the Northwest Ordinance, which forbade slavery in the new territories uh, um, that were, because don't forget the boundary of the United States, because of the Treaty of Paris that secured our independence, the boundary went up to the Mississippi River. And then obviously the expansion of the Union was an implicit question, even with the Articles. And in fact, the Northwest Ordinance, which prohibited slavery in the territories, clearly anticipated the generation of new states. There was some question originally whether the existing states would simply extend their border westward to the Mississippi, but very quickly with the secession of Vermont from New Hampshire, and Vermont as the 14th state, and then it was clear that the Union would be expanding by new states. But here's the point about the way people lived. It was also clear then that the population of America would be mobile, and that the Western settlement and industrialization and commercialization would in some ways intensify, as it did, the question of the existence of slavery in the Union, and intensified and in some ways radicalized both the emancipation, anti-slavery elements of the American regime, and also hardened um, the institution of slavery in the existing states, and also in some ways um, uh, created a harder edge among the pro-slavery elements, especially in the southern states. Although one of the things you have to remember is that Madison in Federalist 54 says it's the laws of the states that treat, because the three-fifths clause, which both Storing and Wilentz clearly explain it against the contemporary misunderstanding that the three-fifths clause meant that the framers viewed African Americans as three-fifths of a human being, or that three blacks were equal to five whites, or five blacks were equal to three whites. That's not what the three-fifths clause meant at all. Now there is an issue about whether the three-fifths clause is meant to. I'm petting my cat, who's not my cat, Frozen here. Um, um, uh, there's no question that the three-fifths clause became bound up with the amount of political power that the slave states and the slavery position had, not just the question of the recognition of slaves as property or as human beings. But what Storing and Willentz's account do is they clearly do reverse the common misunderstanding that that's what the three-fifths clause was about. It's always important to remember it's the Southerners who wanted to count slaves as full persons because that was a measure of wealth. And it's the Northerners, the northern states in the convention, that did not want to count slaves at all, so as to not give more political power, so that Southern states couldn't benefit from the standpoint of representation and political power in the Union. They couldn't benefit from possession of slaves. Um, so, uh, and as Storing's article points out, um, both in terms of the founding and the Constitution, but also what I list is E now, the next stage in the regime. You could say this that uh, that um, uh, the question of whether the three-fifths clause was a was would in the long run benefit the political power of slavery in the Union was in some ways an unsettled question and depended upon developments that were to occur in the first decade and several decades after the Constitution was ratified. So, what's the next step in the regime, and what is that step? What's its relationship to the question of slavery? And here I've gone from 1791, which closes the formal founding period. So you could say about that time, the institutions of the United States were fully set up. And the way I described it was the regime is getting fleshed out and eventually collapses into secession and civil war. And 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 in some ways, you could say that. So where did this happen in the regime, and why did this happen? So on the level of ideas, you had of course, that's what the Constitution fixed. You had natural rights with mixed republicanism, mixed national republicanism with residual state sovereignty. And the reason I put confederalism there is a certain sense in which you could say that it was the issue of slavery then that began to radicalize the tensions within the regime and eventually led to its destruction. Um, and so, um, what was happening institutionally now, bearing in mind, as Storing points out, and as we know from history, that even though the Constitution was ratified and the Anti-Federalists lost the debate, the position of supporting the expansion of state power and it became in some ways the interpretive question of whether or not federal power should be expanded and become flexible, which was, of course, the position of Washington, Hamilton, and John Marshall in the Supreme Court. Um, and and yet, you could say, in some ways, that also started to enforce certain confederal elements. And especially here's where the issue of slavery becomes more important, because you have to say that the southern states began to drift to a kind of a national, to a kind of embrace of more confederalism as opposed to the new federalism of the Constitution that Storing describes in his book On the Anti-Federalists. And so, in terms of the institutional level of the regime, federal power does expand. I mean, don't forget, it's important that the first decade of our national life was run by the Federalists, and that meant those who viewed the expansion of federal power and the consolidation of the constitutional framework over several, like Marbury v. Madison and McCulloch v. Maryland, etc. Now, this also then began to radicalize the element of slavery in our regime, because as federal power began to expand, and as you'll see, as the nation began to expand to the west, Southerners became aware that the expanding Southern power over more elements of national life might lead to a situation where the Northern states would have a majority, certainly in the House, once it became clear that population was not going to grow in the South, um, uh, and especially since slaves didn't get the full, the Southerners didn't get the full benefit of counting slavery as for full representation. It was clear that the North and the Northern states, and that's why, of course, the admission of states to the Union as slave or free became such a critical issue. It became clear that with as federal power expanding and the nation expanding north and west, the population, that the South would soon be outvoted, and that's why the equality of the states in the Senate and the question of admission of new states became, in some ways, the one of the nails in the coffin of the constitutional order. Um, so, um, on the level of on the level of laws and policies in the regime, this is where the potential for conflict in the Constitution became actualized. Because remember, of the three parts of in the Constitutional Convention that are the compromise with slavery, the 3/5 clause in Article 1, Section 2, the migration importation clause of such person as such states now existing should think important shall not uh, there should be no prohibition until 20 years after this constitution, which would be 1808, and of course the third one, the fugitive slave clause. It's those two clauses that now become the focus of tension and conflict within the regime, and um, and so the prohibition of the slave trade in 1808 becomes a major step in intensifying this conflict, as did the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 earlier, and Will Entz has a very nice discussion of that. And these tensions began to grow, partially feeding on each other. Um, and the next major step, of course, was the Missouri Compromise, which kind of held the Union together, letting Missouri in as a slave state, but prohibiting. And of course, as you'll see, what Will Entz makes of that is that established Congress's power over the issue of slavery as a matter of national legislation. And you'll see that that feeds into his thesis that the slave is actually an anti slavery document because it admits the power of Congress to restrict slavery in the existing states, and that therefore, contrary to Dred Scott, as we'll see, that slavery is not a species of property which the Constitution guarantees can be brought all over the United States. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which undid the Missouri Compromise and in some ways made possible the admission of more slave states without the limitation of the Missouri Compromise, which was based on the prior exclusion of slavery from the Northwest Ordinance, as we saw. And of course, Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857, which Storing has a very thorough discussion, actually did, and here I think Storing Willens would say what Dred Scott did was actually corrupt the original meaning of the Constitution and the framers, and turned, in fact, the slavery into a pro-slavery, the Constitution into a pro-slavery document, which it was not at the founding. By doing what? By essentially recognizing or arguing that the Constitution did what Willens says it did not do, and which the framers did not think it did, and that was to recognize property in man. Now, and you'll see when we lay Walentz's thesis out a little bit more, the subtlety of his thesis depends upon whether you're persuaded by his somewhat nuanced interpretation of this issue. Um, and so, in terms of citizen customs, habit, way of life, again, this trend of national mobility and Western movement, industrialization and commercialization, also begins to dovetail in the northern states with greater movements, not only, of course, to emancipation within those states, um, but then also ultimately the the limitation of slavery to its existing states, which of course became the issue that tore the Union apart. Um, and then, of course, the other thing uh, to note about this, not only the arguments for abolition and emancipation become more radicalized, and here's where, again, it's interesting where you get the position of William Lloyd Garrison, the radical abolitionist, who came to hate the Constitution, and in some ways makes a very modern argument, which is kind of a combination of agreeing with Tawney and Dred Scott, and with the critics of the Constitution, because um, as you'll see when Storing creates in the end of his article this kind of conversation with his hypothetical framer and us. Um, the question is well, and we probably should wait to discuss this fully until we get the Walentz's take on the Constitutional Convention, um, and the full laying out of his thesis. But uh, but almost everyone would agree that if the northern states, if the non-slave states had not made the compromise, those three compromises that we've already discussed and mentioned in the Constitutional Convention, that the Union probably would not have existed. And so, in some ways, the question that modern critics pose, standing in some ways in the shoes of William Lord Garrison, um, because Garrison came to the conclusion that better for the Union to die or the country not exist than to make its compromise with slavery. That slavery was so evil and so a violation of the core principles of the Declaration that any compromise with it or even toleration of it, because Willentz will go so far as to say that slavery was tolerated by the framers, but not embraced. That's a very subtle distinction, and whether you're persuaded by that distinction, we'll see. Um, but there's no question that that in some ways the answer that many young people today would give would say, okay, if the balance was between national existence under the Constitution and the dissolution of the Union or the retaining of the Articles and the breaking up of the American Union, the framers did have a choice, and that was the northern states could have said, screw you to the South and let them go off as a separate nation. Now, rather than make that compromise with slavery. We'll come back to that because that's a difficult question. And part of that, the answer to that question depends on how you answer the question of what exactly the Constitution did do with respect to slavery. So the other thing, aside, they should know, and by the way, Storing brings more of this in than Willentz, is that at the same time that the pro-slavery arguments radicalized in the South and began to demand the national extension of slavery throughout the whole country, which exactly again was the program of Dred Scott, of Taney's opinion in Dred Scott. Nevertheless, the southern states qualified their own denigration of African Americans as human beings, and even slaves for that matter. I mean, neither Willens nor Storing mentioned this, but the question of slavery in the South was always more complex and nuanced than we're wont to think of it. Most people don't know that in South Carolina, which had the largest slave population in the South at that time, that 10% of the slave owners were black. An interesting statistic. But that fits into Storing's larger argument that the non-personhood of the slave was actually a very mixed and nuanced thing, even in Southern courts, and he gives several examples of that. But there's also no question that the major development in the regime that perpetuated and gave slavery its new life, far beyond the capacity of the framers to see, was the invention of the cotton gin and the generation of slavery as a productive and economically viable way of life, competing with free labor. So um, there's no question that one element of the regime, not in the parchment regime, in the Declaration, in the principles, or in the institution, even the laws and policies, but something that happened in the external part of the regime, in the cultural uh, segment, in the way of life, uh, which had to do with the economics of slavery, did in fact change the place of slavery in the American regime. So, just by way of a conclusion of this analysis of the emergence of the regime, both in general, I'd have the next stage, and we're not going to fully discuss this, we'll come back to this as we move from the Tocquevilles. And in my introductory lecture to the course, when I was talking about the Tocquevillian periodization of American history, uh, there is a certain sense in which one of the cuspal points is the war, the end of the war. Not only because the South is destroyed politically, um, but and that's F on the third page, and that's the 13th and the 14th Amendments, because you could say what happens is is on the level of ideas, the regime now fully embraces the equality and liberty of the principle of natural rights, and moreover, fully completes ideationally the notion of American citizenship as individuals, equal and free individuals, under that, with the addition of the 13th and the 14th Amendments. Not just the 13th Amendment, which literally eliminated slavery as part of the institutional and legal part of the life, the parchment regime, but it also completed a gap or filled a gap which both enabled slavery to exist under the Articles, as I've already suggested, and even under the Constitution. The fact that the Constitution had no national definition of citizenship, um, and which was also the opening for Dred Scott, for Taney, to turn, even if you buy Willence's interpretation that the Constitution tolerated slavery but did not validate it. That's, I think, Willence uses that term several times, and in fact was intended to set in motion the elimination of slavery, first conceptually by not recognizing the validity of property in man. Yes, recognizing the validity of the state laws, the positive state laws, cultural, the conventional state laws that did generate slavery. But Willence's main point, as we'll see, is that the Constitution did not validate slavery by considering it a nationally transportable form of property. And again, Willence argues that was certainly the intention of Madison, and Federalist 54, as I've suggested, and which I appended to the email. You can read that if you like and see from the language yourself, somewhat supports that argument. And also, that's why the 14th Amendment now becomes so critical in the unfolding of the regime, because the 14th Amendment finally defines and overturns. It's actually the second time that a constitutional amendment was passed that overturns a Supreme Court opinion. The 14th Amendment, which is its opening clause, um, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state where they reside. That definition now makes clear what a U.S. citizen is. And you could say that's the full institutionalization of the principle of the Declaration of the equal and natural freedom of human beings as part of the American community. Um, and and in some ways, the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment in abolishing slavery, not only wipes it out of the regime on the institutional level. Now, it doesn't fully, as we'll see, and even the 14th Amendment regime, because right around the corner, there's still Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Acts, and segregation and Jim Crow laws. Um, but you'd have to say that on the level of principle and on the level of institutions now, the regime is now um, uh, non-slave or anti-slave, and has brought the full promise the of the natural humanity of human beings in the Declaration into the definition of American citizenship. Um, just to finish that up, you could say that, as I already mentioned, having said that, and the rest of the clause of the 14th Amendment, of course, is no state shall abridge or deny the privileges or immunities of the citizen of the United States, or deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The three substantive clauses that follow the definition of citizenship in the first clause of the 14th Amendment. Um, um, there's no question that racism still found a way of having an institutional and legal expression, and of course was reflective of the customary beliefs, especially of the Southerners, but not just Southerners too. So, but that poses more unique and complex problems for the United States regime that de Tocqueville will make clear. So at least now we're normal 3 in the notes, and and so let's spell out Willence's main thesis about the Constitution. So his point in the opening chapters is that with the Revolution and the Declaration, a regime transformation begins from the top down. And one thing that it begins to generate on the level of citizen culture and way of life is the movement towards emancipation and abolition of slavery, at least in the northern states, which then really begin to change their laws and institutions as a result. But then also his argument is this is the very thing that when the Constitution, during the Constitutional Convention, and it was clear we're going to move in the direction of national republicanism, that this began to alert um, the Southerners to the potential vulnerability of slavery within the American regime, and therefore radicalized and supported their demands and efforts to find constitutional protection for slavery. Um, and again, the other dimension of that was when it became clear that the Union was now going to be a giant national republic of individual Americans, as expressed in the preamble and as cemented in the ratification procedure in Article 7, which we can't go fully into. Um, and when it also became clear that the national legislature and the government formed under the new national government under the which was the expression of the American people, uh, um, that would be based on proportional representation in the House. That's when then the pro-slavery elements then began to assert themselves in the Constitutional Convention, and now we are at at Willence's core thesis. Um, what is the disposition of the Constitution towards slavery? And if you're looking on page 3 of the notes, this is where I try to distill it. No property in man, which Willence repeats repeatedly throughout the book, as what the Constitution's disposition is, the intention of Madison and the other framers. So let's see if we can state that subtle thesis. His thesis is that the Constitution did compromise, obviously, with slavery, but as a foreign element in the regime that it couldn't get rid of, and that it considered slavery, the framers considered slavery, contrary to its principles and institutions, contrary to what Taney argued in Dred Scott, and contrary to what Hannah Jones argues in the 1619 Project, or John Hope Franklin, as reported by um, Storing in his essay, and for that matter, the general public thought today, which brands the founding as pro-slavery and as systemic racism. Um, so Willence's thesis is that the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution that came out of it did consider slavery to be a violation of its core principles. But yet, for the Constitution to exist, for the Union to exist and come into being, it had to recognize and compromise with the demands of the Southern states, because the Union wouldn't exist without that compromise. Now, again, we can come back to the question of whether you think that was historically warranted, or whether or not, as Garrison suggested, as Willence develops and as we already talked. But again, remember, um, uh, um, Willence's position is also not only Lincoln's position. I think he's right. It was Madison's position, Jefferson's position, and as I've already said earlier, Storing gives plenty of evidence for that. But also Frederick Douglass's position, who started out as a radical Garrisonian, but then eventually was persuaded that Lincoln was right, and will actually, and as long as I have this, from Storing's article on page 138, um, this is probably the clearest expression of Willence's, Storing's, Lincoln's, Madison's, and if this is the true explanation, this is what Frederick Douglass came to be persuaded of. I hold that the federal government was never, in its essence, anything but an anti-slavery government. Why? Why did Frederick Douglass come to argue that? Because he says you could abolish slavery tomorrow and not a sentence or a syllable in the Constitution need be altered. Although ultimately, after the the Civil War, it was altered with the 13th Amendment, and to some degree, as I've already suggested, with the 14th Amendment. It was purposely so framed so as to give no claim, no sanction to the claim of property in man. Frederick Douglass's statement of that is a single sentence distillation of Willentz's nuanced thesis. If in its origin slavery had any relationship to the government, it was only as the scaffolding, this is Douglass's language, to the magnificent structure to be removed as soon as the building was completed. And Storing's interpretation or gloss on that follows. Quote unquote scaffolding catches the intention exactly. Support of slavery strong enough to allow the structure to be built, but unobtrusive enough, not because of a hypocritical attempt to hide out of shame or out of cleverness, um, uh, their embrace of slavery, uh, but unobtrusive enough to fade from view when the job was done. So that's also Storing's thesis. That so going back to my notes and just to make this clear, that these three provisions that uh, uh, um, incorporated protection for slavery uh, in Article 1, Section 2, Article 1, Section 9, and Article 4, Section 3, Clause 3. But it denied, now this is my bolded text, this is Willentz's thesis. It denied slavery any legitimacy, or more important, did not create a nationally recognized and protected species of property in human beings. Again, see Madison Federalist 54. And this is the further Willentzian thesis, which he argues is borne out in the decades after the founding, and Storing, and Douglass, and Lincoln, um, uh, uh, set in motion the containment of Southern pro-slavery political power, looking forward to the containment and eventual abolition of slavery. And again, this is Willentz, Madison, Hamilton, Washington, who, by the way, I must say, of all the framers, comes off cleanest on this question because of all the slaveholding framers, Washington was the only one who truly emancipated all of his slaves at his death in his will and provided for them. Um, I commend, by the way, Ron Chernow's massive biography of Washington. Ron Chernow is the guy that wrote Hamilton, the biography on which the play was based. Uh, and again, Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Storing. So the question which you have to decide is, was the protection of slavery in the Constitution an embrace of slavery? Willentz says no validation that the and again, Storing also gives a very eloquent, and by the way, Willentz and Storing constitute, therefore, in their minds, a refutation of Taney, who clearly departed from the text of the Constitution and the history of these clauses. But we'll see, Storing's criticism of Taney does ultimately come back and allow him to raise some very deep questions about the status of race in our regime. So, So let's then end this module here. I think together with the A and B module are part of this module. I think that amounts to about a 40 or 50-minute class, I'm not sure. And so we'll finish the discussion of this topic in the third module, in which we'll carry forward Willentz's thesis into the development of the early republic up to the Civil War, and Storing's article, which, as you will see, radicalizes this question.